Okay, I think we're live. And today I just wanted to continue Surah 33. I introduced it briefly in my last video. And this is a lengthy chapter. As you know, most of the surahs in the Quran are front loaded. It's arranged. It doesn't have any sort of narrative structure. And the surahs are chronological structure. It's just arranged from longest to shortest. So you have a lot of very long chapters at the beginning, like the cow or the family of Imran, and then it gradually decreases as time goes on until at the very end of the Quran, right before the last, right before the last prayer, you have a chapter that's only 6 lines, basically a paragraph long. But in the middle, before you get to the very short surahs, you have a few moderately lengthy surahs mixed in, and this is one of them. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to finish this, but I'll just uh, progress along, and hopefully we can get some more ground covered. Now, I ended, of course, in by delineating the differences in Islam and Christianity when it comes to adoption. And of course, in Christianity, everyone who's a born again believer and follower of Jesus is an adopted son or daughter of God. And in contrast, in Islam, there is no sense of adoption. Allah has no sons, and he's distanced from his creation. So there's a stark difference, and you can see the practical effect that has in Muslim societies where adoption as such is forbidden. You can have an orphan who lives in someone's home, and of course this happened during Muhammad's time. There were people who were brought into a family's home, but they weren't legally allowed to call them a son or daughter. And it's just one of the many things that marks the marks a very, I don't know how to put it, but just a very retrograde, bizarre society, a society where even within the family you have these deep rooted divisions and this hostility. And you see that even with biological children, the number of honor killings is astronomical in certain Muslim societies like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. But I'll just continue on here with verse 6, and this is an important verse. The prophet has a greater claim on the faithful than they have on themselves, and his wives are as their mothers, and the possessors of relationship have the better claim in the ordinance of Allah to inheritance, one with respect to another than other believers, and then those who have fled their homes, except that you do some good to your friends. This is written in the book. Now, this is a significant verse because Muslims love to make the assertion that Muhammad was just a man. They don't worship Muhammad. Muhammad isn't deified in Islam. And Muhammad himself repeatedly says, I am just a warner. I am just, usually as a defense mechanism, when people point out the fact that he is a self declared prophet, that he doesn't display any signs and wonders. There are no miracles attributed to Muhammad. As I said in my previous video, the only tangible evidence of it, that Muhammad was a prophet that they can actually point to are the military victories of Muhammad. And when you test that out, that's not a sign of prophethood in scripture. Now, of course, there were prophets who led military battles and were victorious in military battles, but that wasn't the distinction that separated them from everyone else. And if you're going to use that as a metric to measure whether or not someone's a prophet, then Alexander the Great was a much greater prophet than Muhammad. So was the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar, who seized power and was going to become the first emperor of Rome. Or even there were even Muslim generals that ensured his early Muslim victories, one of whom was basically cashiered for being too much of a threat to the caliph, that achieved many more victories than Muhammad. Were they prophets? So it's a really thin reed to build your case of Muhammad's prophethood, to say that, well, he won all of these great military victories and he succeeded in uniting the Arabian Peninsula under Islam before his death. But here it says the prophet has a greater claim on the faithful than they have on themselves. Now think about this logically. Muslims say that they don't deify Muhammad. And as I just said, Muhammad himself says he's just a warner, he's just a man, usually as a defense mechanism to rebut claims that he's not a real prophet. But if he is just a man, if he's just an ordinary individual, how do Muslims reconcile that with this verse? It says the prophet, capital P, has a greater claim. This is someone they believe is the seal of the prophets, not just a prophet, but the last and final prophet of God. He has a greater claim on the faithful than they have on themselves. Well, who has a greater claim to you, to your life, than you do? Well, in Scripture, this is something that's attributed to God. God is the one who created you. Therefore, he has a claim on your life. So if he takes Saul on his way to Damascus, if he takes Saul and says, "You've persecuted the church, but now you have to serve me," then he's obligated to do that. And this is a common theme in Scripture, that people were designed in order to glorify God. And it's even one of the five solas for people who are Reformed. But even for Christians in general, there's this basic idea that you were made to glorify God. But what does it say here? It says the prophet, not Allah, but the prophet Muhammad has a greater claim on the faithful than they have on themselves. So he's essentially arrogating the exclusive power of God, or whom Muslims believe to be God. He's arrogating that to himself and saying, yes, serve Allah, but I also have a greater claim on you. So if I tell you to engage in some sort of activity, if I say you have to divorce your wife and give me your wife, which is something Muhammad did to his best friend, then you have to do it. If Muhammad says to Abu Bakr, his lieutenant, and eventually the caliph after Muhammad's death, if excuse me, if he says you have to give me your wife, or you have to give me this portion of your booty, or you have to do this or that, then you have to do it because he has a claim on your life. So in other words, Muhammad is asserting himself to be on par with Allah. Now, not only does this contradict one of the central tenets of Islam, Tawheed, which Muslims say means oneness. So this is a flat contradiction of that idea of oneness, because you're saying, well, no, Allah is not one. He has a deputy, and that deputy is authorized to take whatever he wants or command you to do what his will is, and you have to do it because he's the prophet. So right here you have an entire verse that contradicts the idea of the idea that Muhammad is not deified by Muslims. You have them elevating him and his claim to that of Allah, because no one else besides God would be able to have a claim on someone's life, on their wives, on their children, presumably. No one aside from God. But here you have Muhammad interposing himself and saying, "No, I do." So this is a very good verse to bring up when Muslims deny the fact that they deify Muhammad. And it's also refuted by the fact that when you look at blasphemy trials all across the Muslim world, it's very rare, almost never will you hear of someone being brought up on trial for blaspheming Allah. You see a lot of people who are accused, and a lot of these charges are contrived and made up in order to persecute a religious minority. Hi, Built for Speed. To persecute a religious minority, very often they're involved tearing or defacing or desecrating a Quran. But more often than not, they'll involve someone supposedly attacking Muhammad. Now this was the case with Asia Bibi, the Roman Catholic Pakistani woman who was beaten and attacked and accused of insulting Muhammad. Supposedly, she asked one of her Muslim neighbors what Muhammad ever did for humanity, and she was brought to trial and thrown in prison, languished in prison for years with the threat of execution before she was able to flee to Canada with the help of some very uh, some very dedicated lawyers and Christian organizations and a lobbying campaign and international protest against this. But her basic trial was for blaspheming Muhammad. Now, how can you blaspheme someone who is not God? You just have to think about that for a moment. But this is the usual practice when someone in the Muslim world, whether they're Christians or atheists, or even sometimes other Muslims, are accused of blaspheming. They're charged with blaspheming Muhammad. Very rarely, you could probably count on one hand the number of times in recent history where someone was brought up on blasphemy charges or attacked for insulting Allah or questioning Allah. It almost always revolves around Muhammad. Now, why is that? That's because Muslims deify Muhammad and they elevate him to the status of a god. Despite what they say, this is irrefutable. You just need to read this verse 6 of Surah 33, in order to prove that Muhammad is another god. Uh, you have your own weird trinity in Islam of Muhammad and Allah and the angel Jibreel. Yeah, I just yeah, that's the verse I read. So he's not only asking for special privileges, he's not saying you should heed me because I'm an apostle, which Paul said, imitate him as he imitates Christ. He's not saying that. He's saying, I my person commands your allegiance in the same way as if I were a god. That's what's implied in this passage. Yeah, he's saying the prophet comes before all other men, but not only men. He's essentially um, saying, as I explained earlier, he's saying he has a greater claim on their lives, and who has a greater claim on your life than you? Of course, it's God, but in Scripture, but if you read between the lines here, he's saying, I have a greater claim. So he's saying, I have a greater claim on your life than you do. He's essentially substituting himself for God. Yeah, it's true. there actually are a lot of streams. I think Sam Shamoon and a couple of others are streaming at the same time. At the same time. So in verse 18, and this is a recurring theme in the Quran. Allah knows indeed those among you who hinder others and those who say to their brethren, come to us, and they come not to the fight, but a little, being niggardly with respect to you. But when fear comes, you will see them looking to you, their eyes rolling like swooning because of death. But when the fear is gone, they smite you with sharp tongues, being niggardly of the good things. These have not believed, therefore Allah has made their doing naught, and this is easy to Allah. They think the allies are not gone, and if the allies should come again, they would fain be in the deserts and with the desert Arabs asking for news about you. And if they were among you, they would not fight save a little. Certainly you have in the Apostle of Allah an excellent exemplar for him who hopes in Allah and the latter day and remembers Allah much. And this is ironic. He needed his soldiers not to turn back. Yeah, this is one of the reasons that Allah is often invoked by Muhammad to chastise recalcitrant soldiers or followers of his who aren't willing to sacrifice their lives in battle, or who are timid in executing his military objectives. Now, the irony here is he's saying he's an exemplar, but even though Muhammad did participate in military battles, he by no means participated in all of the battles, and in a large portion of them, he wasn't at the front of the leading. He wasn't leading his soldiers. So you have generals throughout history like Caesar or Napoleon who would be more or less on the front lines, leading and directing attacks. That's not what Muhammad did, and you can actually figure this out when you read other passages in the Quran which which described how he knows these people were fleeing. It was basically because he was at the back of the line, the rear guard. So the reason he could identify these Muslims, his erstwhile followers who had turned their backs or broken ranks because the battle wasn't going their way. The reason he could identify them was because he was in the back. He wasn't leading. So, like, of course, he would see people who were fleeing. And so, in terms of bravery, I don't think you could say that Muhammad was an exemplar. At the very least, he was not someone that you would want to emulate yourself after. But he uses this to chastise any of his followers who are leery of jumping into battle and sacrificing their lives. This is one of the reasons that martyrdom occupies such a high place in Islamic theology. The idea that there's no such thing as eternal security in Islam. This was illustrated by an exchange between Muhammad Hijab and David Wood during their debate when a Nigerian Christian in the audience, one of the few Christians in the audience, asked him, well, how do you know you're going to heaven? And Muhammad Hijab, this was the only time he answered something honestly and directly. He says, well, I don't know, I'm going to heaven. I could go to hell, and David could be going to heaven. And that was the most honest answer he delivered that night, because Islam has no eternal security. But one of the ways to attain eternal security is to die as a shaheed. So martyrdom occupies a huge place, and one of the reasons is because Muhammad needed to facilitate the, these military victories. He didn't start attracting converts when he was preaching for 10 years in Mecca before his exile, before the Hijrah. He wasn't, he, the only, he attracted converts, um, his father-in-law and some family members and a very small band of followers. But once he started promising war booty and the riches, people flocked to his cause, especially after the early Muslims emerged victorious in battle. So this is why it occupies such a central place um, to Islam. Well, yeah, it was martyrdom was important in early Christianity, but the difference is these were people who sacrificed their lives in order to um, fulfill the Great Commission. Whereas in Islam, martyrdom involves attacking and murdering other people from its almost from its inception. Like I said, the first 9 or 10 years or so ostensibly were Muhammad trying to peacefully proclaim his his message of monotheism, and it wasn't successful, which is why he adopted this tactic of the strategy of trying to enlist more people, because they were promised riches, not only temporal riches, but eternal riches. They would be able to enter paradise and be able to indulge in all sorts of carnal delights that they could imagine. And just to continue, in 26 it says, and he drove down those of the followers of the book who backed them from their fortresses, and he cast awe into their hearts. And this is referring to Allah, of course. Some you killed, and you took captive another part. And Muhammad did murder the Banu Qurayza, the entire male population of that tribe. Over 600 Jewish tribesmen were murdered personally by Muhammad himself actually decapitated them, and the women were enslaved, and the Banu Nadir also were expelled. The Jewish tribes were expelled from from eventually it would be the entire Arabian Peninsula, but they were either expelled or the males were killed and the females were enslaved. The females and young boys, prepubescent boys, were enslaved. So this is a reference to the strategy that Muhammad adopted in his fights with Jewish tribes and Arab pagan tribes who resisted Islam. So in 28 it says, O prophet, say to your wives, if you desire the world's life and its adornment, then come, I will give you a provision and allow you to depart a goodly departing. And if you desire Allah and his apostle and the latter abode, then surely Allah has prepared for the doers of good among you a mighty reward. O wives of the prophet, whoever of you commits an open indecency, the punishment shall be increased to her doubly, and this is easy to Allah. And whoever of you is obedient to Allah and his apostle and does good, we will give to her reward doubly, and we have prepared for her an honorable sustenance. O wives of the prophet, you are not like any of the other women. If you will be on your guard, then be not soft in your speech, lest he in whose heart is a disease yearn and speak a good word. So not only is Muhammad himself deified, but his strictures apply more so to his wives. Now, why would Muhammad's wives be doubly punished for an indecency as opposed to an ordinary Muslim woman committing an indecency. And of course, that's because these revelations are not derived from some sort of divine encounter and not given by Allah, but they're created by Muhammad in order to maintain the fidelity of his wives, who were, if you could imagine what a harem or Turkish harem is like, it was like that with Muhammad, and trying to keep his wives in check, who of course were jealous and envious and didn't enjoy the fact that they were one of many many wives. Muhammad had 13, not including his concubines and his sex slaves. He had 13 wives, which granted is less than Brigham Young, but still, it's, if you could imagine how frustrating and humiliating it would have been to be one of his wives. So he invented ostensible revelations in order to keep them in check. But something that he may not have thought of is that this simply reinforces the idea that Muhammad is power mad and is trying to elevate himself to the status of God, so that anything that harms Muhammad or that makes his life more difficult is basically a sin. And when you think about it that way, you realize how absurd Islam is. There's even a verse in the Quran which says, don't come to Muhammad's house at an inconvenient time, either too little or too late. Now, if you understand this to be a book written by Muhammad for his benefit, then of course it makes sense that that verse would be in here. But Muslims believe that the Quran is uncreated and that it's existed forever, and it's not just inspired, but it was transmitted by God without any errors. So they believe the Quran itself um, is wholly holy. It's not created. Now, of course, this this conflicts with the concept of Tawheed, and I explained in an earlier video how Muslims believed in the eternality of the Quran were actually persecuted, even though this is now a universally adopted position. They were persecuted, and Nabil Qureshi describes this in his apologetics book, No God But One. And it's just an indication of how contradictory Islam is, and how rife with contradictions and logical flaws it is as religion. But again, this is him trying to keep his wives in check, and it makes no sense if you think that the Quran was created, or the Quran came directly from God, to have all of these rules that only apply specifically to Muhammad. It makes no sense. But if you understand that this is a book written by Muhammad in order to benefit Muhammad, then of course it makes perfect sense why you would have things in there punishing his wives more severely than other Muslim women who engage in the same sin. And in 33, unfortunately, this didn't just apply to the uh, the repression, more generally speaking, didn't just apply to Muhammad's wives, it applied to women in general. So in 33 it says, and stay in your houses and do not display your finery like the displaying of the ignorance of yore, and keep up prayer and pay the poor rate and obey Allah and his apostle. Allah only desires to keep away the uncleanness from you, O people of the house, and to purify you a thorough purifying. Now, as I just explained in that earlier passage, it has nothing to do with keeping women pure. It has to do with reinforcing the hegemony Muhammad exercises over his harem, his multiple wives. It had nothing to do with keeping them pure. Um, and this too, the restrictions you see in Islam in terms of what women are to wear, what they're to display, the the things like the mutaween in Saudi Arabia, which even though they've been reined in to a great degree, there's still severe restrictions on what women can wear or do outside of the home. And in Iran, the enforcement of laws related to the shador are increasingly harsh. But ever since the Islamic Revolution, women have been detained and interrogated and raped even in prison for refusing to abide by the clothing restrictions in Islam. And this is not to reinforce chastity in women, because you see that in Islamic societies, even women who wear the abaya or the shador or the hijab, even those women, 80% of them are sexually harassed or assaulted. So it has nothing to do with instilling some sort of modesty. It's more about exercising control. And in 35, it says, "Surely the men who submit and the women who submit, and the believing men and the believing women, and the obeying men and the obeying women, the truthful men and truthful women, the patient men and patient women," and this goes on for an entire paragraph, all the way up to the men who guard their private parts, and the women who guard, and the men who remember Allah, and the women who remember Allah. Allah has prepared for them forgiveness and a mighty reward. And this verse is an illustration of how someone mentioned the how incoherent the Quran was, and it is, but it's also mind-numbingly repetitive. So you have verses like this, which is just a huge block of text that is just him repeating something over and over again, first with regard to men, but then women, and just repeating it over and over again for about 60 or 70 words, just a long block of just a long block of word salad. And this is one of the reasons most people, including the vast majority of Muslims, never actually read the Quran. They listen to it being recited uh, by a muezzin. They hear it in the mosque, but it's in a different language. It sounds very mystical and ethereal, but they don't really read it, because even if they read it in their language, they would have to digest things like this, and it's probably one of the worst books to actually read. Just leaving aside all of the admonitions to commit violence and attack people who have a different belief system and engage in all sorts of prurient behavior, even leaving that aside, it's just one of the most monotonous, repetitive, and incoherent books. Ibn Warraq, who was raised in a Muslim family and wrote some great books examining the history of Islam, including Why I Am Not a Muslim and the Origins of the Quran. Even he said, he's also said this, that he's spoken to Muslims and they agree with him. At least 25% of the Quran, even in the Arabic language, is ununderstandable. It's completely, you can't understand it. At least a quarter of the entire book. I was a Quranic Muslim for years. I've read it many times. Yeah, a lot of Muslims do read, but my point is, most do not. First of all, because it's not in their language, but also, even if they're even if they read it in their language, even if they know Arabic or they read a vernacular, it it, it's strange to actually force yourself to plow through 430 pages of this. The obeying men and the obeying women and the truthful men and the humble men and the humble women, on and on and on. And it's certainly not inspired. Uh, Even the chronologies, for example, in the first 10 chapters of First Chronicles, even those, as boring as some people might find them, are more interesting than much of the Quran. Um, so it's certainly not. If you look at it from an objective standpoint and lay aside all of your presumptions and just read it, you would never be under the impression that this was divinely inspired, let alone created by God. Uh, so that's verse 35. And in 36, it says, "And it behooves not a believing man and a believing woman that they should have any choice in their matter when Allah and his apostle have decided a matter. And whoever disobeys Allah and his apostle, he surely strays off a manifest straying." Um, and again, you have Muhammad being linked inextricably to Muhammad. Now, when Paul and Barnabas were thought to be the Greek gods Jupiter and Mercury in the book of Acts, they tore their clothes and they tried to explain to people that they were just men witnessing to the deity of Christ. But Muhammad has a completely different take. He never shies away, even though as I said, he says he's just a warner and this and that. When you actually get to the prescriptive text in the Quran, advice that's supposed to be applied universally, Muhammad always elevates himself, links himself to Allah. So you have to say that Allah and his apostle have decided a matter, and whoever disobeys Allah and his apostle, he surely strays off a manifest straying. Now, uh, when Paul said to imitate him or to follow him, he said as Christ. He never tried to convince people that his teachings were on the same par on par with with Jesus. And in fact, he commends the Berean Christians in the book of Acts 17, the beginning of Acts 17. He commends the Bereans for searching the scriptures to see if what he's saying is true. So in other words, he compliments believers who ask questions and discern for themselves whether or not what he's saying is in keeping with the teachings of Jesus and with scripture. And this is in marked contrast to Muhammad, who says, don't ask questions, obey him and Allah. And if you do ask questions, you're essentially engaging in sinful behavior or sinful thoughts. So in verse 37, it says, "And when you said to him to whom Allah had shown favor and to whom you had shown a favor, keep your wife to yourself and be careful of your duty to Allah, and you concealed in your soul what Allah would bring to light, and you feared men, and Allah had a greater right that you should fear him. But when Zaid had accomplished his want of her, we gave her to you as a wife, so that there should be no difficulty for the believers in respect of the wives of their adopted sons when they have accomplished their want of them, and Allah's command should be performed." Now, again, this codifies how twisted uh, Islam is. And I just want to go back to my point about adoption, how the concept of adoption is a foreign concept of Islam. You could have orphans, house them, but the idea of treating them like a son or a daughter was inimical to what Muhammad believed. And as I said in the previous video, this stems from the fact that Muhammad himself was treated very shabbily as he was growing up and was shuttled from house to house after both of his parents died. And the Arabian culture itself, Islam did not grow up, did not emerge from a vacuum. The Arabian culture itself demeaned the idea of family and particularly all orphans and children, especially female children. And this is one of the reasons you see women suffering so much in Muslim countries, particularly ones that adhere more closely to Sharia. But this idea that Allah is managing the managing the marital affairs, and also this idea that Allah would want his apostle, the seal of the prophets, to commit what's essentially adultery, even though it has the imprimatur of acceptance by the Quran, that he would want him to commit adultery and to take the wives of his of his companions or his son-in-law. It's really a really twisted idea, and it's one of the reasons you see so many problems within Islamic society. You have a culture that's based on a book that deprecates love and fidelity and just values that are the cornerstone of any functional civilization. Whereas in the early Roman Empire, when Christians were suffering persecution, they would adopt Roman children who were left to die, who were left to die of exposure or kicked out of their families because they couldn't afford to, particularly girls who were considered worthless in much of the ancient world, and still are today in places like in Islamic nations and other parts of the world. They would actually take in children who are abandoned and raise them. In fact, this is depicted in the film Paul, an Apostle of Christ, which shows Priscilla and Aquila taking in a little boy that was abandoned by his Roman family. But in Islam, you have this distorted perception of family and marriage, and it runs through the veins of Islamic society, and it's a real problem. It's why these Islamic countries, almost every single one, is struggling and is just an example of every maladaptive behavioral pattern that you can imagine. He did not marry his daughter-in-law. He married oh, hi. He married the daughter of let me just say hi. He said to care for the orphan. Yeah, that's in the Quran. But my point is, he prohibited adoption in the sense of raising an orphan child as your son or your daughter in the same way, and taking them into your family and treating them as a son, or treating them as a daughter. In other words, you could take them in, but they would essentially be a warder, like um, they would be like a water. It would be, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the George R. R. Martin novels, a, a Song of Ice and Fire, the series of novels, and it was turned into an HBO series, Game of Thrones. But there was a character in there who was raised in Winterfell, who was essentially raised by that family in Winterfell as but he was more or less a hostage because he was sent there in order to ensure the good behavior of a rival claimant to the throne. And that's essentially what Muhammad how Muhammad viewed these children. Like you couldn't raise them as a son or a daughter, which is what most people do when they adopt a child. Uh, Islam has muta. Yeah, well, the funny thing is, muta itself is a Shiite practice. This idea of having a temporary wife, and Sunnis reject it. But if you go to the Quran and you go to Muhammad, he practiced, he endorsed temporary marriages. So Shiites actually have a better better claim in this regard than the Orthodox Muslim position, because Muhammad and his disciples, people who followed him and were involved in military conflicts, they were allowed to engage in temporary marriages. So even though the muta as a concept is practiced by Shiites, it's a valid. It doesn't allow dates, but temporary marriages, which is analogous to what most people would call prostitution. I mean, that's what a temporary marriage really is. So that practice, like I said, even though muta is a Shiite practice and it's rejected by Orthodox Sunni Muslims, the Sunnis are wrong on this. The Quran actually endorses muta. Now Sunnis would say, well, that was just for Muhammad, and this is something that was only valid at the time of Muhammad, and in modern times it's not something that's a contemporaneous practice for Muslims. But there's no proof that this was abrogated. There's no indication that the idea of a temporary marriage is something that was um, nullified. Uh, well, no, like it's in the Quran, like the idea of having a temporary um, marriage. I don't know the exact term for it. Like I said, muta is a Shiite practice that Sunnis reject. But the thing is, the Shiites are right about this. The Quran actually permits temporary marriages. Like in this context, they would say, "Oh, that was just for Muhammad and his soldiers because this was a time of warfare and they were uh, away from their wives." Or I don't know the exact specific arguments they would use, but they would say this is not valid for today. But my point is, there's nothing indicating that this was an idea that was abrogated. Uh, that this part of the Quran abrogated. Um, I mean, Muhammad, he had, like I said, he had 13 wives. He had numerous concubines or sex slaves. So marriage itself in Islam is a really farcical idea. It's not marriage in any traditional understanding of the term. Like, uh, and granted, a lot of Muslims don't practice that. There are uh, normal, uh, normal Muslim marriages, but there are also many, particularly in certain countries, certain Muslim countries, many polygamous marriages, and many men who visit uh, prostitutes and engage in Iran. They are actually considering making it legal. The government there making muta illegal. And again, it's a Shiite practice, but Well, I mean, the sex slaves of uh, the former wives or the widows of the Jewish tribesmen that he slaughtered. I mean, that's one. I mean, he was actually poisoned by a Jewish woman whose husband he had killed. And this is one of the things people bring up when Muhammad's prophethood is asserted. There's a hadith that says Muhammad, if he were a false prophet, would die by having his aorta severed, and that's exactly how he died. But yeah, she was his wife because he killed her husband. I mean, that's why she was his wife. But I don't want to get sidetracked on here. I just wanted to illustrate the weird precedent that Muhammad established for marriage. Now, like, of course, there are many Muslims that don't have these types of marriages, but these types of marriages are considered valid according to the Quran. Hi, Inky. So in 39, it says, those who deliver the messages of Allah and fear Him, and do not fear anyone but Allah, and Allah is sufficient to take account. And this is preceded by a verse that says, there's no harm in the Prophet doing that which Allah has ordained for him. Such has been the course of Allah with respect to those who have gone before, and the command of Allah is a decree that is made absolute. Now, this is something else that's simply not true, that there were prophets before Muhammad who engaged in the type of behavior that he did. Now, there were some prophets that were engaged in warfare, but this idea that there were prophets that God specifically carved out exceptions in the law in order to benefit them, like Allah ostensibly did for Muhammad, so that he could have more wives or cheat on his wives or do this or that. That's simply not true. There was no prophet who was given a special dispensation to break commandments or to break laws so that it would benefit or it would glorify God. So this is simply not true. And it's another piece of evidence that Muhammad never actually read scripture, which is why he couldn't distinguish between the Torah and the Talmud. He couldn't distinguish between pseudo-epigrapha and apocrypha and scripture, the actual canonical books of the Bible. And this is one of the reasons, because he didn't actually read, he didn't understand the Bible. So he says that he's somehow following in the footsteps of other prophets, which is simply not true. And it's also not true that you should only fear Allah, because in the same chapter, he arrogates to himself the ability of judgment and other things that are the exclusive reserve of God. He could not read. Yeah, I mean, that's a recurring theme. There's even a bit in the Muhammad's Boom Boom Room, the series on Acts 17 apologetics, about Muhammad being illiterate. It's like a recurring theme to explain. It's like a gag. But yeah, this is what I mean. That's one of the things that Muslims will use to assert that he was a prophet because he couldn't read. So how could someone who wasn't able to read transcribe the Quran? And I mean, there's a number of flaws in this theory. Just the fact that the historicity of Muhammad. I mean, I believe he was a real person, and more or less who he's described as. But the historicity of Muhammad is something that's very contested. His biographer isn't. There isn't a biography of him until over a century after his death, and that Ibn Ashaq, and even that is not. We don't have copies of that until I think another 100 years. So it's not like the original. And there are just so many things about his life that are there are so many things about his life which are disputed or questioned. So, but yes, the fact that he's it's claimed that he wasn't able to read is used as an evidence that the Quran is a divinely created book. Um, but to me, that's not really evidence of anything, especially when you read the Quran. So it says in 42, and glorify him morning and evening. He it is who sends his blessings on you, and so do his angels, that he may bring you forth out of utter darkness into the light. And he is merciful to the believers. And angels is one of the 6 articles of faith of Islam, but like predestination and like so much else, Muhammad had a very distorted interpretation of who angels were. Um, he would have benefited from reading the Epistle to the Hebrews, which describes how angels are underneath Christ, how they're because they were created just like everything else. They were created by Christ. So there was a distorted view of angels, and in 48 it says, 47 it says, and give to the believers the good news that they shall have a great grace from Allah. Grace is another concept that's distorted in Islam. And be not compliant to the unbelievers and the hypocrites, and leave unregarded their annoying talk, and rely on Allah, and Allah is sufficient as a protector. And of course, this conflicts with the idea of persecuting those who reject Islam, which is another core doctrine of the Quran. So here it says, don't regard their annoying talk, but at the same time, Muslims are enjoined to persecute and attack people who reject Allah and His apostle. So this is another seeming contradiction in the Quran, even though it says be not compliant to the unbelievers and the hypocrites. That could be interpreted in a number of ways, either violently resisting them and attacking them, or just ignoring them. But again, if you take the second option, then you would have to say it conflicts with the overriding message of the Quran, which is to attack and wage war against unbelievers, not just simply ignore them. O you who believe, when you marry the believing women, then divorce them before you touch them. You have in their case no term which you should reckon. So make some provision for them and send them forth a goodly sending forth. O prophet, surely we have made lawful to you your wives whom you have given their dowries, and those whom your right hand possesses out of those. And this is a reference to sex slaves. John asked, what sex slaves did he have? This is a reference to sex slaves and those whom your right hand possesses. That's a euphemism for women who were sexually enslaved and subsequent to that made either the wives or the concubines to Muhammad and his companions and his followers. So you see, and those whom your right hand possesses, and this is a phrase that occurs dozens of times in the Quran, and it's always in reference. They became wives because Muhammad killed their husbands, or sometimes didn't kill them. In fact, there's um, a verse where his men are protesting that the women they want to take are married to men who are still living, and he says that's fine, that Allah makes that licit, and that they shouldn't worry about that. But usually they're wives because he murdered their husbands or had them executed. But a another issue here is that this idea of being able to just divorce women, and this is something that's endemic to Muslim society. There was a big uproar when the Indian Supreme Court outlawed triple talaq, which is basically saying, I divorce you 3 times, and it was considered a valid form of divorce and an abrogation of the marriage contract, the nikah. And this is something that's prolific in the Islamic world, divorcing women, leaving them destitute after having the children of these men. And this is something that's based on the Quran, where Muhammad had rules that are not scriptural. Even in the Old Testament, when Moses said you could have a bill of divorcement, you needed to have a valid reason, and um, the valid reason was something like fornication, or or be living in the house of a father, of your father, and engaging in something before marriage. So there needs to be some sort of valid reason, but even that, Jesus said there's no valid reason for divorce except for fornication, and people who divorce and then remarry are committing adultery. And Muslims rely on a book that says no, you can divorce a woman for any reason whatsoever. It doesn't matter. You can just leave them, just as long as you take care of their dowries. Uh, you can drop them, and this is another illustration of how twisted the Quran is when it comes to female male relationships and marital relationships. So let me just finish that verse, and I think I'll wrap up and finish. There are two more pages, but I'll finish that up in another video. I know this has been a long. Uh, it's already two videos, and there's going to be a third, but by then we should be wrapped up with Surah 33. So it says, "And those whom your right hand possesses, out of those whom Allah has given to you, as prisoners of war." See, I didn't finish that part, but that's the dead giveaway that these are sex slaves. "And the daughters of your paternal uncles and the daughters of your paternal aunts." Now um, these would be cousins, "and daughters of your maternal uncles and the daughters of your maternal aunts who fled with you, and a believing woman, if she gave herself to the prophet, if the prophet desired to marry her, especially for you, not for the rest of believers." And again, this is the hypocrisy of Muhammad. Uh, Ruse for me, ruse for thee, but not for me. "We know that we have ordained for them concerning their wives and those whom their right hands possess, in order to that no blame may attach to you, and Allah is forgiving, merciful," particularly to Muhammad, who he's forgiven many sins and said that they're not sins, even though they are. But according to Muhammad, they're not. And that's an interesting dichotomy. And this is Surah 33. Like I said, there are only two more pages to go. I should have a quick video wrapping it up either tomorrow or sometime this week. And I'll see you then. Thanks everyone for joining. John, First Corinthians, Mark, Inky, of course, GW, and Andrew, and Built for Speed. And I'll see you next time.